welcome to the Amsden High Street and Shiloh online service. I'm doing a little something different. I'm here in the chapel at High Street instead of recording from my living room to give you a little bit more of a churchy feel. I know a lot of people have been asking me lately when we are going to have a chance to meet again, and I want you all to know that we are making those plans, but they are complicated. I know they're going to be different for different churches also because, High Street has more people, so there are greater restrictions there. But we are talking about those plans, we are making those plans, and I would love to explain more to you. So if you want to know more about what the guidelines are that we need to follow before we can meet again in person, and what we need to consider before we can do that, please give me a call this week. My phone number is 419-721-2030. And if you give me a call, we will talk through that. I would love to hear from all of you, and I would love to get your input. And most especially, I would love to ask for your prayers, because this is really hard. It's one of the hardest things I've ever had to do is try to decide how to open these churches safely. And it's been very difficult. And so Pastor Jim and I would love your prayers, we would love your support, and we would love your input. But know that we are paying attention, we haven't forgotten, and we're listening. So with that in mind, let's start with a prayer. God, it's weird being in this empty room. God, I miss everybody, and I want us to be together again as soon as possible. So give me the wisdom to know when that is safe to do. Give us all the strength to be able to follow through with the guidelines. Give us all peace and patience as we learn to care for each other and still worship you at the same time during a global pandemic. God, be with us in our worship today, whether we're watching from home or come into the drive-thru service later. Be with us all as we worship you together. In Jesus' name, amen. I would like to add one thing, is that I think even when we do open, whenever that may be, I know there are going to be some people who feel comfortable showing up, and there are going to be some people who don't. And I want you all to know that I will continue doing these online services indefinitely. In fact, I kind of regret that I wasn't doing them before the pandemic, because there are always people who can't come to church. And I wish I would have started earlier doing these online services so that everyone could feel, or more people could feel, included and welcome. And so I will keep doing these so you never have any pressure to show up in a situation where you feel unsafe. And until then, give me a call this week and we will talk through those guidelines and try to get a date set. It might be a tentative date and it might change because of the nature of this pandemic, but we will try to figure something out for you real soon. So let's start with a song. Let's sing hymn number 64, Holy, Holy, Holy. Sunday, I believe, and so we do celebrate the Trinity and the God in three persons who is holy, holy, holy. So let's pray. Let's lift up all of our prayer requests to the triune God. God, you are one in three. You are a community. You are diversity and unity. You are three and you are one. And we need a three and a one God today. We need a world where diversity and unity can coexist, where people who are different can live in the same world as equals. God, make this world more like you. Bring your creation back to how you intended it. A world filled with diverse people and animals and plants and species who are still all one, united in our Creator. In your name, amen. Will you join me again in another hymn, hymn number 504. It's Old Rugged Cross. Our scripture reading for today comes from Mark chapter 13. It starts in verse 24. But in those days, after that suffering, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. They will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds and from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, the very gates. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will not pass away. But about that day no one knows the hour, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey when he leaves his home and puts his slaves in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on watch. Therefore, keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight, or at cockcrow or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake. The word of God for the people of God. Now, as I've mentioned many times before in my sermons, I grew up in a very fundamental Baptist church, one of those churches that's always talking about the end times. And when I was younger, I spent a lot of nights lying awake in bed and thinking, oh no, what if the world ends tonight? My church growing up would read passages like Mark 13 and teach us that someday, well, we don't know when, God is going to come back and there's going to be a great tribulation and you have to make sure you're ready. It's the kind of thing you read about in like the Left Behind books, which I read. I'll just say I read enough of them that I would sometimes panic when I couldn't find my mom, and I would think, oh no, what if she got raptured and I've been left behind because I wasn't a good enough Christian? I read enough of these books in high school that I often caught myself praying, God, please don't let the rapture happen until after I'm old enough to have a boyfriend. In other words, I spent my entire childhood afraid of the end of the world. Now in college, I changed churches and I became a United Methodist, and in my experience, the Methodist churches aren't quite as focused as the Baptist churches were on the end of the world. In my experience, the Methodist church talks a lot more about God's love and God's grace and a lot less about the end times. So for me, that was like this huge weight off my shoulder, right? I could finally breathe and not have to constantly worry about the end of the world. But then these past few years have happened, and I don't know about you, but I've been feeling some apocalyptic energy these days. Maybe you can tell by my sermons. In my defense, I usually just preach from the lectionary, so it's not like I choose the apocalyptic passages most of the time. But with the state of the world in this past few years, there's this feeling of dread. There's this feeling of hopelessness. There's this feeling of an impending doom that I get not just from the church, but from people all around me. I see this in people outside the church and within. This sense of dread that I'm getting from all directions. I remember right before the 2016 presidential election, I got a card in the mail that was reminding me to vote, right? And this card listed like the main candidates. It also listed the third-party candidates. And then it suggested some write-in candidates as kind of a joke. One of these write-in candidates was Giant Meteor of Doom 2016. Now, of course, it's a joke. No one's going to vote for a giant meteor to hit the earth, hopefully. But the fact that an official election mailing was sent out and thought to joke about listing a giant meteor hitting the earth as a potential presidential candidate kind of tells you a lot about the state of the world. Now, as a pastor, I am not allowed to endorse any candidates from the pulpit, but I'll admit, sometimes that giant meteor of doom looks pretty good. Now, that was in 2016. 4 years later, and I'm not sure things are much better on the apocalyptic front. I check in with my out-of-town friends on Facebook, and I see some disturbing things. I see friends having to get tested for a deadly virus that has thrown all of our lives out of whack. I see other friends, fellow clergy who went to pray at a peaceful protest in their robes and their stoles, and got pepper sprayed in the face. You see the pictures with the tears streaming down their face. You hear these stories of innocent people being hurt and civil liberties being ignored, and I have to admit, I find myself unwillingly thrown back into that apocalyptic anxiety of my youth. I can't stand up here and pretend to be above it all. Sometimes I'm afraid. Sometimes I feel hopeless. I get stuck on these awful images, and I start to kind of give up on humanity. I start cheering for that giant meteor of doom to hit. I find I can't imagine humans figuring out how to stop destroying ourselves and each other anytime soon. And I wonder if God is ever going to show up and fix things, or maybe if God has given up on us too. So it's with this anxiety that I revisit Mark chapter 13. This is a passage that I've intentionally avoided since my days in the Baptist church because it's a really difficult chapter. This is a chapter that a lot of scholars and church fathers referred to as the little apocalypse. Revelation is the big apocalypse, and Mark 13 is the little apocalypse. No big deal, just a little apocalypse, right? Many of the early church fathers thought this little apocalypse was referring to the second coming of Jesus. The church I grew up in, of course, thought it was about the rapture and the Great Tribulation. And many, modern academic scholars kind of seem to think that this entire passage isn't really about the future, the far future, but is about the destruction of the temple, which happened in 70 AD at the hands of Rome. And that all this stuff about angels gathering up the elect is kind of just metaphorical. So that's kind of what modern academic scholars think. And still others see this little apocalypse as being about the death and resurrection of Jesus, which would defeat the powers of death in the heavens. So not so much a coming apocalypse as this thing that Jesus already accomplished. Now, these are all very different interpretations of the text, and I don't know which one is right, but they all have something in common. What they have in common is this. This little apocalypse is describing the end of a world. Maybe not the end of the world, but definitely the end of a world. Definitely the end of everything that people are familiar with and the life that we know and love. So I'll admit, in my college years, as I left the Baptist church, I really was drawn to the modern academic scholarly route of interpreting this passage. You know, I wanted to see Mark 13 as just this kind of irrelevant, superstitious, outdated passage that's metaphorical and has no real impact on today's world. But when I read it now, I get the sense that the same anxiety that was among Jesus' disciples is still here in the world today. And this passage is anything but irrelevant. At the beginning of the chapter, which was not a part of our reading, but which helps us kind of get the context of this passage, a disciple comments on the beauty of the temple in Jerusalem at that time. It was a beautiful building that the people in Judea were so proud of. And Jesus replies almost callously, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." I turn on the news, and if you watch the news long enough, I guarantee you'll see once great and impressive buildings somewhere in the world reduced to rubble. And Jesus continues. He says, "When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. But this is the beginning of the birth pangs. You don't have to read the Left Behind books to see that our context today is not that much different than Jesus's on this front. And then we get to our passage, which we read earlier. We get to Mark 13:26, which says, "The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken." And this seems a little extreme, but in a world where we have created climate change at such level that we can melt the polar ice caps, is it really that outrageous to think of the sun being darkened? And it's not that hard to picture a mushroom cloud blocking out the sun. We still fear those shakings of the power in the heavens. This passage speaks to us of ancient fears that are still with us today. Now, it's kind of a bleak picture. Or is it? What does this passage actually say to those ancient and very modern fears? Does this passage say give up? Does it say go hide? Does it say every man for himself? Does it say quit trying to make the world a better place? Does it say everything is useless? Might as well look out for me and mine? No, that's not what this passage says. What it says to those ancient fears is this: watch, keep awake, and have hope. And amidst all the scary parts of this passage, the sun being darkened and the moon not giving its light, what the real message of Mark 13 is this: watch, keep awake, have hope. You see, our fears about the end of the world are about as old as time. Fears about the end of the world didn't start when the Left Behind books were written. They didn't start with the invention of the nuclear bomb or with climate change. Fears about the end of the world are as old as time. And they're natural and they're understandable. We've always lived in a broken world that seems like it's right on the edge of unraveling. But these fears, even though these fears are natural and understandable, they're also kind of dangerous if we let them be. If we aren't careful, these fears can drive us apart. You see, it's hard to keep awake. It's easier to give in to our fears than allow them to drive us to apathy, to numbness, and to despair. It's easy to draw into ourselves and to give into this destructive anxiety. When we lose the ability to hope for a brighter future, we begin to plan for the worst. In our desperation, we might be willing to do anything to protect ourselves from a perceived threat. We might think, if we invade that country over there that we're afraid of, if we end the world for them, maybe the world won't end for us. Or if we allow the use of excessive force against those people, if we end the world for them, maybe we can protect our way of life and not have to consider what might need to change for everyone to be protected. We become so afraid of others that we become afraid to live. We become afraid of the things that make our lives worth living. A few years ago, when I announced my engagement to my now spouse, Abraham, a person I knew from my old church expressed concern about that. You see, she believed the apocalypse was going to happen on a very specific date. It was going to happen, I still remember, the world was going to end in March 2013. And Abe and I were supposed to get married in August 2013. And so this person thought that instead of spending our money on a wedding, we should be spending it all on food to store up in case the world ended in March. So, lest you think I'm just picking on Christians here, I'll have you know that it's not just us Christians who are afraid of the end of the world. I saw an article in a secular newspaper a couple years ago, I think, that announced that because climate change was so bad, no one should have any children. We shouldn't be bringing any kids into the world because the world's going to end, so why bring a child into that world? So, in addition to the actual epidemic we have going on right now, I think for years, this world has had an epidemic of despair. We as a people have lost hope for the future. And when hope for the future dies, so does relationship. When hope for the future dies, you have to be afraid of your neighbors. You have to be afraid of building relationships. When hope for the future dies, the temptation is to care only about yourself. This is dangerous. And I want you all to hear this, and I want me to hear this, because I am subject to these same temptations. If you're afraid of the end of the world, if you can't even turn on the news without the temptation to despair, first of all, you're not alone. I've been there. I'm still there some days. And 2,000 years ago, Jesus' disciples were there. But Jesus did not tell us to despair. Jesus did not tell us to despair. Jesus told us, watch, keep awake, and have hope. Watch and keep awake. That's hard, isn't it? I know the temptation is to pull the covers over your head and cast your vote for the giant meteor of doom and be tempted by policies that promise we can save our world by destroying those people over there. Maybe it's even tempting to pick up a bottle of whiskey and drown out the pain of the world. But Jesus does not say despair, give up, become defensive, quit loving others, only care about yourself and your own people, black out on the couch so that you don't have to think about it. No, Jesus says watch, keep awake, and have hope. And Jesus points to the signs of hope in these passages we read. A fig tree about to be filled with fruit. A birth about to occur. The nearness of the kingdom of God. The end of the world in this passage doesn't mean death. It means new life. So watch, keep awake, and have hope. Have hope. The despair is tempting, as Jesus certainly knew. As he stood over the Mount of Olives, looking at this beautiful temple that was about to fall, looking over a world that was about to end. But he said, have hope. He looked out on that world and said, have hope. And we don't have hope from destroying everyone we perceive to be a threat. You know where we find hope? We find hope by standing in solidarity with those who are hurting, by joining hands with them, metaphorically, because there's still a pandemic, so careful holding hands, but by joining hands with those of us, with those around us, and saying, I am with you. When we stand together, we can lift one another out of this sinking pit of despair. We can break down the walls of fear and hatred and racism and violence and control. And when we break down those walls, light shines through. When we break down those walls, we're not left with rubble. We are left with a new world. So the world ends in Mark 13, a world ends. The temple was destroyed. Jesus was killed. Walls were broken down. A world ends. And maybe parts of our world are about to end as well. But that's not the end of the story. That's not the end of the story, because when we break down those walls, it's going to feel like the end of the world. But Jesus says, watch, keep awake, and have hope. Because the end of the world is just God's way of creating something better, something beautiful, something new. Watch, keep awake, have hope. Let's pray. God, it's easy to despair in today's world. It's easy to see our way of life being threatened and to draw into ourselves and shut others out, to reject people and ignore the pain and suffering of our brothers and sisters in Christ. But God, we find hope not through shutting ourselves off from the world, but through hearing and standing and marching with those of us who are hurting. We find hope with joining together with others to build the better world that you promise. We find hope in staying awake, being engaged, caring for ourselves and caring for others as we try to break down the walls that divide us and create a new world. God, you give us life in the midst of death. You give us resurrection after crucifixion. God, you create a new world from the ashes of the old. Amen. Let's sing one more song, hymn number 620. Go forth into a broken world, knowing that Christ is with you. Resist despair, break down the walls of hatred, watch, keep awake.